In 2009, Mitsubishi Motors introduced the Mitsubishi i-MiEV to the world. Based on a vehicle that was already available for the Japanese market, the i-MiEV was designed to be sold as not only a keijidosa, a K-class car, but a denki keijidosa, an electric K-class car. Sorry to any Japanese speakers watching. I know that my pronunciation is terrible. In Mitsubishi's case, the diminutive size of the i-MiEV was due to Mitsubishi wanting to sell the i-MiEV as a K-class car. But when Nissan launched the Leaf a short while later, it wasn't all that much larger than the i-MiEV. It was designed to be a family-friendly car that could get the job done. It had 5 seats, enough luggage space for a weekly shop, and the ability to rapid charge, rapidly at least for the time, on a road trip. All with a battery pack and powertrain capable of an EPA-approved 74-ish miles, about 120 kilometers per charge. At the time, many car buyers, especially in markets like the US and Canada, bemoaned the size of those early EVs of the 20-teens. They wanted something larger and quote-unquote safer. They wanted something that could carry more things and sat higher and did all the things they thought they might potentially need to do with the car during their ownership of it, but likely never would. And thus, in the past 10 years or so, particularly here in the US, there's been an inexorable growth in the number of larger, more powerful electric vehicles on the market, mirroring the growth in size of internal combustion engine vehicles. They've got bigger motors, bigger frames, and bigger battery packs. And they're becoming the norm in our driveways. Here's why, for the most part, that might be a bad idea. A bad idea for us and the planet. If you're a regular viewer to this channel, you'll know that there's something of a large elephant that I need to deal with in this video. A large blue elephant. Namely the fact that I own and drive a massive blue Ford F-150 Lightning Lariat extended range pickup. It is, by far, the largest vehicle I've ever owned. And I used to own a Volvo 240. And I do understand the hypocrisy of making a video about vehicle size and weight and not discussing my own personal £6,500 behemoth. That would be disingenuous. So I will, later on in this video, because I want to cover the topic of appropriate use a little later on. I'm just mentioning it here so that those of you who make a decision to criticise without watching the whole video might just maybe reconsider. Or as we say in my birth county of Norfolk, UK, hold you hard. Today, I'm going to cover the concept of increasingly large EVs on our roads by first examining the parallels in the internal combustion engine world, then examining why automakers are making increasingly larger EVs and why it's easier for automakers to go big than it is for them to stay small, discuss appropriate use, and then finish off with some waxing lyrical about freedom of choice versus ethical consumerism. History first. Back when I were a lad, and I could easily devour a book in a single sitting, there was a fun little title by Roald Dahl that I'd regularly consume at the weekend. It was called Danny, Champion of the World. I loved it not only because it spoke to me, it was set in a rural part of the UK, and Danny's father stuck it to the local lord of the manor by carrying out a little light pheasant poaching at night, but also because it included a vehicular star. A baby Austin, or to give it its correct name, an Austin 7.
Nicola Harriet Gordon-Bloomfield. Sweetie darling, no. You know the proper pronunciation is Austin.
Yes, okay, Catherine. One of us grew up in rural East Anglia and the other grew up in the home counties. I'll let you decide which was which. The Austin 7 was a bit like the UK's answer to the Ford Model T. Except it was a lot smaller, nearly half the size of the Ford Model T, in fact. It was sold in a variety of different guises over its 16 years of production, from two-door Tourers and coupes through to cargo-carrying vans, because pickups never really took off in the UK like they did in the US. It offered many people exactly what they wanted in a car and was as much a tool as a means of transportation. Its size was as big as it needed to be in order to get a variety of jobs done. And while I'll admit that it was designed and produced during a period where resources were constrained, so using less metal per car meant you could make more of them for the same amount of raw materials, it did set the tone for what many small compact cars would look like for decades to come. But we humans have a tendency to equate size and power with social status. Bigger is better. Faster is better. We did it with horses, we did it with steam trains, and we do it with cars. However much we try to use high-level cognitive reasoning to justify doing stuff, we humans still run on hardware that can still be hijacked by more primal decision-making, something that psychologists like to call our reptilian brain. And just as dogs will usually choose the larger bone or birds the larger worm, we humans default to choosing the bigger car. There's a whole series of videos we could do on the psychology of wanting a bigger car, and we often find ourselves finding ways to justify things like big car purchases. But at the base of it all, bigger and more powerful, in some parts of our heads at least, equals better. As manufacturing constraints of the early 20th century were replaced with more modern production methods and material resources became less of an issue, adding luxury features to cars became more of a thing, and our vehicles started to grow in size. Vehicles ceased to be just about being tools and more about being status symbols. And again, there is an element of reptilian behaviour in the desire to have the largest, fastest, most desirable car because it, at a psychological level, shows other people that we are... Insert your chosen desirable quality here. Before I leave this segment, I also want to throw a bone to the effect that war has played on the psychology of civilians and ex-military service personnel when it comes to vehicle choice. Because we've also seen that several times in history, and it helps explain the embiggenating of our cars. After World War II and after Korean and Vietnam Wars, when Jeeps were returning from the front lines and available to civilians with one careful owner, people snapped them up. They were designed to be simple, repairable, and safe-ish. And if you've just come back from a war zone because a vehicle helped save your sorry ass, you're gonna feel a certain attachment to that vehicle. The same can be said in a lesser way for more modern military vehicles, like the ultra-massive Humvee. Although, in that case, many more civilians ended up with them because of the perceived indestructibility said vehicles demonstrated in more contemporaneous conflicts. Then there's physics. If you are in an accident between a small light vehicle and a heavy large one, you are going to stand a better chance of walking away in the big large vehicle than you will in the small light one, assuming that is that both vehicles have similar construction and energy absorption characteristics, which they rarely do. Take a quick look at small frontal overlap crash tests for many pickups from the last few years, or the Jeep Wrangler, and you can see that big or heavy does not always equal safe. There have to be other things in play too. But while automakers work hard to make smaller vehicles safer, the original Tritium safety cell of the original Smart for 2 is a good example of this. Physics is unfortunately a total control freak and wants to make sure that the books are completely balanced in every collision. But, and there is a massive but here, EVs trend heavier than internal combustion engine vehicles because of those battery packs. Sure, battery packs are much more energy dense today than they used to be, meaning they can store more energy per unit volume and unit mass than they used to be able to. But rather than focus on reducing the physical size and thus weight of a battery pack in order to make EVs lighter, the auto industry is locked in a metaphorical arms race to make faster and faster, longer and longer range EVs. And as we've noted plenty of times in the last few months and years on this channel, larger batteries do generally mean longer range, with the average new EV today capable of upwards of 3 times the range of those original Mitsubishi i-MiEVs and Nissan Leafs. And in case you're wondering, that early Nissan Leaf? While it might have been classified as a subcompact, its weight was closer to that of a contemporaneous full-size sedan. Today's newest EVs are even heavier. The Volkswagen ID.4, a mid-size SUV, weighs more than most large-size cars, more than most small trucks, and is frankly pushing into some mid-size pickup truck weight categories. Simply put, when you buy an electric vehicle, you might be getting next up vehicle class interior size and luggage, because electric motors are far more compact than internal combustion engines, but you also go up a class in terms of vehicle weight. That extra weight, along with more stringent crash testing that's required for cars, might mean a Nissan Leaf or a Chevrolet Bolt EV has a better chance of keeping you safe in an accident with a big pickup truck than, say, a Nissan Versa or a Chevrolet Trax, or indeed another pickup. But many consumers say those two EVs are too small or don't travel far enough, and thus, automakers, quite happily because larger vehicles are easier to sell for more money, push ever increasingly large vehicles with ever increasingly large battery packs. Battery packs which can get you further per charge, but also increase your vehicle's mass. That increase in size affects how safe the vehicle is for other road users, and the increase in weight affects that same safety, but it also affects the efficiency of your vehicle. I'm going to deal with efficiency first. The larger the battery, the more onboard weight. We already did that, but the heavier a vehicle is, the more energy is needed to push it along the road. Unless, of course, there are improvements to the vehicle's drivetrain and power electronics, or the vehicle has an incredibly efficient aerodynamic design. Aerodynamics and a low frontal area is, for example, why the Hyundai Ioniq 6 has just received an impressive 360-mile range rating despite having a 77 and a bit kilowatt-hour battery pack, when most EVs with similar-sized battery packs, by the way, struggle to reach anything above 250 miles. And aerodynamic smarts is why Aptera is promising a seemingly impossible 10 miles per kilowatt-hour for its upcoming solar electric vehicle. Electronics efficiency is how Tesla and Lucid manage the ranges they do. Whilst efficient electric vehicles exist, we, as consumers, tend to worry less about efficiency and more about range, partly because we're all transfixed on the thing, and partly because electricity is relatively pretty cheap. Frankly, if electricity were to cost as much as gasoline, we'd all be rushing to pick the most efficient EVs over the largest or the fastest. Which brings me to the safety element. Because EVs are heavier for a given class than internal combustion engine vehicles, and because of the aforementioned race to make every car, ICE or EV, larger and larger, the average weight of new cars is on the rise. When everyone is rolling around in a multi-ton vehicle of similar size and weight, that's not so much of an issue if there's nobody else on the road. But there are other road users. Here where I live, in rural Oregon, there's an almost constant stream of cyclists in the summer, using the slow but continual climb from the valley floor up to well over 1,500 feet at the peak as the perfect training hill. But the road is not perfect. There are lots of blind corners. And in every bit of suburbia, there are pedestrians walking and children playing. In the country, there are animals that will jump out of the bushes. Statistics around the world show that while cars are becoming safer and safer for people inside them, they are simultaneously becoming more and more dangerous for people who aren't in them, vulnerable road users. For those who don't know, Kate Walton-Elliott here at the channel works part-time here and the rest of the time in an ER, an accident and emergency for the Brits. She has to deal with the daily aftermath of people who meet a car, but who themselves are not in a car. And it's not pretty. If you want to know just how not pretty, just go and look at the crash test ratings of recent vehicles to note that as hoods or bonnets have become higher, crash test ratings for pedestrian impacts have become worse. And while I'm at it, I should point out that the US only fairly recently implemented crash test ratings for pedestrian v car impacts. And also, while I'm at it, because not everyone knows this, in some markets, like the US, larger vehicles like pickup trucks and big SUVs don't have to satisfy the same crash test requirements as passenger cars, and that means that they are often not as safe as a similar-sized passenger car, although that's changed somewhat since some spectacular crash test failures in pickups were rather prominently reported in the media. But also these trucks are given an easier time when it comes to not worrying about if you're going to totally mow down the person who just stepped out in front of you. Yeah, I'm sorry, maybe that was badly phrased and uncalled for, but it is true. We collectively need to be better about our vehicles. We, as drivers, can mitigate the risks of collisions with vulnerable road users by making sure that we are not distracted drivers, that we drive at an appropriate speed, we pay attention to warning signs, and we give ourselves extra time when the weather conditions outside are poor. But as consumers, we can also make sure when we buy our next car, we aren't buying vehicles that aren't increasingly large and obnoxious, which brings me to appropriate use and consumer choice and my own personal blue elephant in the room. I'm pretty confident that the majority of people watching this live in a multi-car family with multiple vehicles available to them. So when you next look to buy a car, look at your overall fleet and its potential uses rather than buying a vehicle that will do all the things you ever need to do with it because you already have a second car that likely fills up some of those gaps. And pick a car that is appropriate for normal use case scenarios for you, not exceptional uses. For me, frankly, we were right on that limit when we opted to buy our £6,500 behemoth that is the Ford F-150 Lightning. For those who are interested, £6,500 is, by the way, just shy of 3 metric tons. In an everyday world, if I lived in a suburban home and I worked in an office, in a desk job, the F-150 Lightning would be a total overkill for my daily driving needs. Commuting in it may feel nice. I mean, it's got great seats and it drives like it's a much smaller vehicle, but it is completely unnecessary for many local trips. It is, by the way, one of the reasons we still have my wife's Chevrolet Bolt EV and why we are looking to add Open Pilot to that car, so it's more fun to drive and comparable to Blue Cruise on the freeway. Running this channel, with all of the lights and cameras and equipment we have and a staff of 5, means that we can throw everything into that truck to drive to events, which reduces the amount of times we have to fly places. Additionally, my partner actively woodworks, and we have animals, hopefully more this year if we get goats. So something that can haul straw and hay and lumber is useful for us. Again, if we didn't live in a super rural place, I don't think we'd own the truck. We also tow with it a fair amount. In the last 9 months since we purchased it, we've made plenty of long-distance trips hauling things. We've driven some of those cross-country with a trailer. I've even helped my niece, who lives on a chicken farm in the middle of nowhere here in Oregon, move her tiny house around the farm. And here I am cognizant of my own hypocrisy. I've just made a video about how we should all be buying smaller vehicles, and here I am, with one of the largest, most obnoxious, largest EVs on sale today. But I like to think that my truck is made to work. I'm using it for the most part as a tool rather than a trophy. It is filthy right now. It's got straw and hay and sawdust all over it. And I know that there are other options I could have taken, like renting a truck for longer distance trips or having stuff delivered. They were options we actively considered. But because the truck does triple duty as a light farm vehicle, backup power for the house, and a work truck for the company, I'm okay with its size because when we use it, we try and do appropriate things with it. Would I have preferred a vehicle that met those needs and also had to meet stringent pedestrian safety standards? Absolutely. There is not a single day that does not go past when I walk past my truck and remember that the top of the hood is at boob height. At the same time, we are taking the Bolt for trips whenever it is smart and sensible to do so, leaving the big truck at home and taking the small compact hatch instead. To finish off the video, let's look at one final thing we've not discussed yet: resource management. The larger the vehicle and the larger the battery pack, the more raw materials you need to dig out of the ground and refine. As GM admitted last week, the obscenely large 220 plus kilowatt hour battery pack in the Hummer EV is quite a bit of a headache for the company right now. For every Hummer EV that rolls off the production line, you can make 3 and a bit Bolt EVs in terms of battery packs. And as a channel that really wants equity and affordability in the EV marketplace, we here would all rather that 3 mid-sized affordable EVs be made instead of one obscenely massive and powerful truck. And to that end, as somebody who owns a truck that is frankly overpowered, I personally would welcome taxes on heavier, less efficient EVs like big, obscene pickups if it meant that automakers made more affordable, more sensibly sized models that are safer for other road users and use fewer resources. Fewer resources consumed per vehicle means either more EVs on the road for a given resource availability, or lower demand on raw resources for a given number of vehicles, which means you have to dig less stuff out of the ground, less environmental damage. Both of those options are pretty darned good. Supersizing our EV may make us feel invincible. It may mean that we can travel further on that long-distance trip that we might make once a year that, frankly, we'll probably fly anyway. And it may help us alleviate the concern of poor and unreliable EV charging infrastructure. Those are all valid concerns that we can tackle in other videos. At the end of the day, though, larger EVs for just being larger's sake aren't the answer. Sure, the chances are that if you are watching this, you probably live somewhere in a capitalist society of some description, where as long as you have the money, you can do whatever the bleeding heck you want. But if we are really going to make a change, and we not only need to make a change for the safety of others, but also to reduce our carbon footprint, we need to start thinking long and hard about exactly why we want that massive new EV and why something smaller or more efficient wouldn't work just as well. And if we do own one of those massive vehicles, we always have to ask ourselves if we could take a smaller, more efficient one for that grocery run to the store. And on that note, we are done with today's video. If you want to know more about the vintage Mac behind me, stick around until after the credits. If you liked this video, you know what to do, and feel free to tip us with a super thanks. The comments are open for your thoughts, as is our Discord chat room, link below. If you want more from us, subscribe, hit the bell, and follow the links to regularly support us with a YouTube membership or a Patreon subscription. You'll also find links below to Ko-fi, Bitcoin, and swag stores. And check us out on Mastodon because we have our own server. It's very cool. Scrolling on my right is the list of amazing Charged Up supporters, and shout-outs go out to our self-driving tier supporters. They are Mike Weeder, Tony Moss, Linda Irish, Sean Tucker, Patrick Boyarski, Paul Nelson, Chris Maxwell, Brian Newton, Michael Goad, Bennett Elder, Andrew Martin, Pedro Mura Pinheiro, Brophy Wolf, Chris and Michael Johnson, Tazlet and the Gong, Dan Bear, Peter Dillinger, Gordon C., Stephen O'Donoghue, Carl Hodgson, Anthony Coates, Regine Fellows, Denny Hyde, Chris Centaur and Jim Burness. Finally, out of the world, thanks to our Starman level supporters: Robert Flannery, CPU Freak 101, Andrew Glenn, Anonymous Freak, JP Fagerback, Joe Bresney, John Lyons, Rory Litwin, Kevin Burrowbridge, David Kitchen, Aaron Hahn, Laura Reynolds, Marcel Ward, Matthew Drobnak, Paul Conway, Reggie Watts, Will Graylin, and Ian. I or somebody else from the team will be back with more videos soon, but until then, thanks for joining me and keep evolving. So this is my only G3 computer in my collection. It's actually the first PowerBook that I picked up to collect. I've had PowerBooks previously, but they were always work machines that then I replaced. But this is the first older PowerBook that I've actually actively kept. It was given to me by my dear friend Adam and Becky in Bristol. It used to belong to Adam's father. It was in really good condition when I got it. Probably about 10 years ago now. And it still has 2 battery packs in it, one of which still works, which blows my mind. You can still take it around and run it for like 2 hours on its original battery, which is a bit hard to fathom, but it still works. It's not been upgraded that much. I think it's got like 1 gigabyte of memory, and it still has the original processor card. I would love to get a G4 upgrade for it. It's a Pismo, I think, if memory serves correctly. But it's in great condition cosmetically, and it still works. Side note, when we started Transport Evolved, and I used to do that little podcast, if you haven't watched it, go back and watch one of them. They're very different. It was the Mac that I had in the studio. I had a wall of Macs that I used to have different Skype calls coming in on, and then I'd mix all the video and audio together so that everybody else could hear everybody else without getting feedback, and I could record each person individually. And this machine was what I used to run a chat client on. I had a little chat room, an IRC chat room that would run on that machine, and it would just about survive. And that was in service for the company until about until we moved in 2015. And then after we moved, it's just become part of the collection. But as I explained in other videos, we're bringing them all back. All of my vintage Macs work, and they're going to be part of the set. I have a PowerBook. I have a G4 Cube and a G4 Tower. I think I said it was a sawtooth last week. It's not. It's a gigabit Ethernet that I'll bring out and put on here at some point. But I don't have an appropriate monitor. So if you have one of those original Apple displays, I'd love to talk to you, because I'd love to get one.